Welcome to New Mexico People, Places, and Ideas. I'm Stephen Spitz. On today's show, New Mexico's roadside marker program began in the 1930s. By 2005, there were over 500 historic and scenic roadside markers, and exactly one featured a woman. Today's guest, Pat French, was a co-founder of the New Mexico Women's Forum and was instrumental in righting this historical wrong. Pat French, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Well, it's really great to have you, and congratulations on making our history more conclusive. And that's really what I want to spend the first part of the show on. Then I'd like your take on how such a obvious discrimination could have continued in our state until really quite recently. And finally, we have to hear about some of those 100 women who were not recognized but now are. But to start with, what I read was that you were also actually the first person to suspect this disparity. And I'm really curious about how you noticed that or how you were able to discern that.
Well, my husband and I and our 2-year-old son traveled to New Mexico in 1978, and we traveled by car. We had a Ryder truck. We were coming from Brooklyn, going to Santa Fe, and to start a new life in New Mexico. And so along the way, we traveled up to Santa Fe, and then I spent a lot of years going back and forth in the 80s and 90s with our family, and then our daughter, too, who was born in New Mexico, seeing the state. And we also bought a ranch in southern New Mexico, so in historic Monticello. And so wanting to know the history, because we were newcomers. And so it was wonderful to research, to stop at markers and to stop anywhere we could and learn about the history. But I sadly found that there were hardly any women mentioned anywhere.
So you were literally driving around, and when you'd see a marker, you'd stop, or did you know where they were, or?
Oh, I didn't know where they were. I did not know where they were, but I would stop. And often that would be a stop that we could all get out of the car and stretch our legs. And I started reading them, but it wasn't just the markers. It was everywhere. I would go to museums and read as much as I could about the state that I didn't know much about.
And during what time period were you doing this?
80s and 90s. In the 90s, we bought a ranch. That's when we bought our ranch in southern New Mexico. So we would regularly make trips to the southern part of the state.
So the 80s were a really significant time in women's history, right? I mean, I was a lawyer in my former life, and that was when Sandra Day O'Connor became the first Supreme Court justice. It's when Sally Ride was the first woman to go into space. It's when Geraldine Ferraro became the first vice presidential candidate. So this was a significant time in women's history, and I guess my question is, was this something you were particularly focused on, women's rights, activism?
I was focused on it in the sense that I was a founding member of the International Women's Forum in New Mexico, and that started in the late 80s. And so we were a group of women who were we were part of a larger group of women recognizing women's rights. That had, the trailblazers were all before us, but we were still wanting to learn about women in New Mexico who were present women who were leaders of New Mexico.
And that was and is the purpose of the Women's Forum?
The Women's Forum is supposed to, one of the goals of the Women's Forum is to embrace women's leadership and to identify women throughout the state, the country, the world that can help elevate women.
So this interest in roadside markers and whether any women or sufficient women were on them, that fits right into what you were interested in and what the forum was interested in, right?
Yes. And so moving along in 1996, when we were, if I may, when I was walking with a group of friends who were all women forum members on Linda Davis's ranch, which is on the historic Old Santa Fe Trail, that I decided to mention it to the friends that I was walking with, the concept of doing something about this. I had wanted to do something about the marker issue for some time, and I'm an ideas person, so I kept on thinking, well, what can we do about this to change these markers or to add to these markers? And so I mentioned it to friends as we walked on the Old Santa Fe Trail.
Let me back up and just make sure people understand what a historic marker is. I mean, I'm sure most people do, but could you just describe what they are?
Oh, thank you for asking that question. So originally, when I started looking at the markers, all they were and all they are, which are significant, are they're handmade, large wooden markers, wooden signs at turnoffs on the highways throughout New Mexico that depict generally the environment, the history, and in the past they depicted it. At the time that I was studying them, they depicted what I then further studied was about 174 men that were mentioned, and only one woman was mentioned, but she was not even the subject of the census. So that was Maria Martinez. But that they were largely done, I think, at the time because travel by road was something that would invite tourism in New Mexico. So a lot of the signs related to cowboys and desperados and men who created potential interest in why you should visit this area.
So you just said that I think that there were 175 men on these markers and one woman, and I'd like to know, did you know this in 1996 when you were walking the Santa Fe Trail and mentioned your question to the friends you were walking with? When did you discover this imbalance?
Well, the total imbalance, I mean, actually, I did not know that it was as bad as it was in terms of 174. I did not know that number until in 2005 when I brought this up again to the Women's Forum officially, and they embraced the idea of doing a project that would mention women on these markers. That's when I decided that I needed to absolutely know each marker that existed for the men and how many existed that, and further delineate what there was for women. And for women, there was some mention of women as the wife of, that type of mention, but not, except for Maria Martinez, she was the only one mentioned by name. So that was a study that I did when the forum decided to fully embrace the project, which was in 2005. So this whole process took some time.
So why don't you tell listeners who Maria Martinez was? If it's the only woman mentioned, you can bet that she was significant. So who was Maria Martinez?
Maria Martinez was a fabulous. She was from San Ildefonso Pueblo, and she and her husband Juan created the black pottery that at the time was used for household things, but then became an art form. And her work, basically, her beautiful black pottery, not only did she create it, but then she taught other people in the Pueblo how to make it. And it basically became a foundation for the success of the Pueblo, financial success of the Pueblo. So she's in museums all over the world, and her work is adored. And we were fortunate enough also in the 1980s to maybe it was the 90s, that we met her before her death. She came to a meeting. It was the 90s. She came to a meeting of the New Mexico Women's Forum. And that was a great joy.
So this was that black on black matte polished Santa Clara pottery that I think became so popular, not in the United States, but all over the world, right?
Exactly.
Well, I want to go back and just ask you just a couple more things about that initial conversation you had in 1996. But let me first mention this is New Mexico People, Places, and Ideas. My name is Stephen Spitz, and I'm very pleased to be talking with Pat French. Pat was a co-founder of the New Mexico Women's Forum, now the International Women's Forum, and she also was instrumental, as you've been hearing, about correcting the imbalance in recognition of women on historical markers. And Pat, what I read was the two women you happened to be walking the Santa Fe Trail with in 1996 turned out to be also very instrumental in this whole project. Beverly Duran and Alexis Girard. And that when you raised this question about like how many women really came along on the Santa Fe Trail, it was Beverly Duran said, yeah, well, and what about Camino Real? You know, we hear a lot about Don Juan Oñate, but what about the women who came?
Beverly and Alexis were pivotal in terms of they were good friends. They are good friends, and if it were not for them, I probably would not have gone forward with this. I don't remember Beverly specifically saying that line then, but I do know that that this was something extremely important to her because Beverly was, I think, 14 generations New Mexican, if you can be that, and Alexis also had lived in New Mexico for a long time. And again, I was a newcomer, and they said to me, well. Particularly Beverly said to me, you know, we will support you. If this is your dream, we will make this happen. So that was, and they did. They became, Alexis and Beverly and I ran the project from 2006 to 2010.
So just for context on the disparity, Title IX of the Civil Rights Act, which prohibits sex discrimination, that actually became law in 1972. And the reason I mention that is I want your take on how this disparity could have existed. I mean, it existed, as you said, all the way to 2005 when you first actually got the data on how bad it was. And since you've been, I think, thinking about this for let's just say a number of years, I wonder what you make of it. How could that happen? How did it happen?
I can only say that in arriving in New Mexico and realizing that one could go and living close to the capital, one could go and lobby on any subject. And I did that. I would go in areas that interested me. I would go into the capital, and I realized at that point and earlier, it was an all-man's legislature. There were some women who, as we know, who were notable on our marker project, who were first secretaries of state as a woman, or were people who were involved in politics all along the way. But largely, law was made by men. And frankly, right now, one of the things I'm thrilled about is having a woman governor who has strongly supported this project. And I do have to say that Barbara Richardson, who was the honorary chair of this project when we began, was, she was very important, influencing her husband, then Governor Bill Richardson, to help us get the funds. I personally solicited her, and so how did it happen? I think it happened, just because it never was corrected, and New Mexico was slow in terms of women's rights. It was a cowboy state, oil men, cowboys. That was its origin, and women were the backbone of the state. The Pueblo Indians, the women were the ones who created, who built, who plastered all the houses, and that was also true. It later was true of the Hispanic women who came after them. They learned that same beautiful tradition of plastering. I mean, so the foundation of women in New Mexico was always strong, but it was the men that ruled the land.
You mentioned that you had the support of Barbara and Bill Richardson, and obviously in the legislature, that that's huge, in getting something passed. But I'm just wondering, you also needed a lot of money to do this. In other words, you just didn't need a bill that said, okay, from now on, we're going to have equality. You wanted to go back and right the wrong and introduce all these women who hadn't been recognized. And to do that, you needed funding. And I guess it went through capital outlay, and capital outlay is a really screwy thing in New Mexico. It's like one-third to governor, one-third to each individual legislator, one-third to each individual senator. So that sounds to me like it must have been very difficult. How did you get that money?
Well, I first solicited Bill Richardson and got a pledge for half of the money from him.
That came from his capital outlay, you're saying?
It came from his capital outlay. It was at the end of it was monies that were to be used for something else that he knew that he had, and he said he would put it there. So I was leaving the country on a trip, and I then said to Alexis and Bev, would you, they were in charge of soliciting, of rather making the legislature come along, and the legislature did. They were great because those two women went to every legislator and asked for funds, and so the other half of the monies came from the legislature. Actually, a little bit more. I think it was $150 from Bill Richardson, and the rest from the legislature of the 330.
So it passes, and then there's a request for proposal put out by the legislature, and the Women's Forum decides it's going to bid, and you get the contract, right? And then
that was difficult. That was a surprise to us, Stephen, because we didn't realize we had to bid for our own project. We had no idea that we had to do that, and because we were novices in this. We were people who had an idea that we wanted to see fulfilled, but oh my gosh, now it was suddenly really happening. I hope this is an encouragement for people, for women, and for everyone else who realizes that things can be still done here in this state. And if you have a dream, follow up on it.
Well, if you've just tuned in, this is New Mexico People, Places, and Ideas. My name is Stephen Spitz, and I'm very pleased to be talking with Pat French. Pat discovered and later found out specifically the imbalance in historic roadside markers between men and women. She then got her forum, the Women's Forum, to pursue it, and they've actually changed the historical record for New Mexico. And Pat, after you get the RFP and after you're going all how it should be done, and you get down to selecting, and that alone seems to me to be very difficult because you're talking about history, and you're talking about history all over the state. That seems alone to be one heck of a project, how to pick these people.
Yes, we really never had enough time to do this, in my mind. We wish we had more than the initial 4 years to do this, because we decided to do it through the counties, and that was, I had researched that different states work through the municipalities in creating markers. This was not women's markers, but just in general, that's how they did it. And I thought, well, the counties would be great. Beverly followed up, and she went to many of these county meetings. So we had in terms of our process, we had a selection committee, and on that selection committee was representatives from the Association of Counties, representatives from the New Mexico Commission on the Status of Women, historians, public members. So all of these groups were involved in the process, but the main process was to ask the counties and ask the pueblos and tribes for their nominations first. That alone took a lot of time, the time that we didn't necessarily have. We did get nominations from the public.
Well, speaking of not having enough time, I want to turn to who some of the women are who weren't recognized and who are now recognized. And, there's over 100 women now recognized. We're not going to be able to be fair or representative to that group. But I'd like to start you off with one unbelievable, incredible story of a woman who is now recognized who hadn't been, and that's Sally Rook. Could you tell us her story and why she became recognized?
Yes, of course. Well, Sally was in her 60s when she decided to travel to this little community of Folsom, New Mexico, which is part of Union County. And when she was there, she got a job as the telephone operator for this small little town. And one day, she had just been there for a few years. She had been notified by someone on the telephone that a big flood was coming to her community, a huge flood, and that she needed to spread the word. Well, she got on the telephone and she called every single person in the community as the waters were rising and the town was being completely flooded. She saved most of that community by her efforts, and in the process, she lost her life. Her little shack that she was in got turned over and destroyed. They found her body years later downriver, and we did a celebration of her life because we felt very strongly. All of us felt that women were an important part of every community. And that community, the process of studying women was also studying community. And when we did our celebration of Sally's life, the people of Folsom all came out. This was so many years later, and they all came out, and they talked about that they wouldn't have been there today if it hadn't been for this brave woman saving them. At the time, she had no gravestone at all on her grave, and the women who were the telephone operators around the country heard of this, and each gave a dime to create a gravestone for Sally Rook. It's little things like that. I mean, you don't have to be a famous person such as Otera Warren, who now is commemorated on a quarter, which is fabulous. You didn't need to be a famous person to do something meaningful for your community, as Sally had done. I found another woman like that, if you don't mind my mentioning her, which is Netta Christie, who was a woman who had been somewhat lost in history, and she was the first Black osteopath, the first African-American osteopath in the United States. And she was living in Las Vegas, New Mexico, where when we did door-to-door research, knocking on doors, I found people who knew her or knew of her. And then we informed the American Osteopath Association, and they decided to honor her. She is now honored in Black History Month, which, just came about by researching someone who wasn't terribly known.
Would you like to mention any other people? I mean, we don't have a lot of time, but if you'd like to mention a couple more people, please do.
I can mention one or two more. I'd like to mention the celebrations that we had, which were a big part of the project, and I hope will continue on. The Sisters of Loretto. I think it's important to note that not just Archbishop Lamy, but also the Sisters of Loretto came to New Mexico, and they created the first school for women in Santa Fe, but they basically educated half of the girls that existed in New Mexico at that time. And we did a wonderful celebration of their lives. And the Sisters of Loretto today from all over the country came in to honor the Sisters of Loretto marker, which now sits on across from Loretto Chapel on East Alameda.
I find the Sisters of Loretto really fascinating because it really brings up something about this historical change that I think is really important, which is you're not taking something away from Bishop Lamy. You're not saying this was not an important contribution. What you're saying is there are other people who also made a contribution, namely the sisters themselves. And I think that is like an addition to history or a supplement to history or an inclusiveness of history. And I think that's what's so fascinating about what your project was.
Yes, I think that's what you just nailed it. I think that's perfectly said. I mean, I would like to mention one other person that we did a wonderful ceremony for, which was Esther Martinez of Oke-Awinge. I mean, we're celebrating people who are the foundation people of the history of New Mexico. Esther Martinez, also in her 60s, was charged basically by people around her to do the first dictionary on the Tewa language. It wouldn't exist if it weren't for her. And so the celebration that we had at the Oke-Awinge Pueblo, hundreds of people came, family members from all over came in to celebrate this incredible, incredible woman and her saving of language. So it's people like that, women like that, I mean, she lived a normal life with raising 10 children on the Pueblo, but then when asked, realized how important it was to document and save a language, which helped save a people.
Yeah, I find her story really fascinating because she actually, I guess, spoke Tewa, fluently, but she couldn't read or write it, and she taught herself how to read or write it, and then created the first Tewa dictionary.
That's right, and she also created the first Tewa Bible, or not Bible, but New Testament.
No kidding. What you've added, like I had read, I read the markers. You've added so much context to these stories. It's wonderful, your involvement and what you know about these people and how you celebrated these people. I really want to thank you for what you've done and congratulate you for what you've done.
Thank you, Stephen. Can I mention one brief thing, which is that if you go to the website today, to our website, you will see what's going on now, because thanks to the governor, there's more monies to educate, inspire everyone, our population, particularly young women. And they're now doing a wonderful program for children who are K to 12. There's going to be a curriculum program in the schools, and there's a traveling exhibition in the libraries happening. So I just wanted you to know that the project in a program form is living on in outreach.
I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Once again, congratulations, Pat French, and thanks for coming on the show. Thanks also to my producer, Gus Tafoya, and my engineer, Roman Garcia. My name is Stephen Spitz, and you've been listening to New Mexico People, Places, and Ideas on KUNM. Podcasts of this show are available wherever you get podcasts. Search Stephen Spitz. Archives of past shows are at stephenspitz.com. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.